Let's talk about Mark Steyn. So he won't be returning to GB News after recovering from 2 heart attacks. I wished him well via Twitter and he gave it a little heart, so all good fun. Because, unfortunately, the British government's media regulation board, Ofcom, said they didn't like what he said about certain recent medical interventions.
A product.
A product, yes. They didn't like what he said about Viagra. Not a big fan, so didn't like that very much. It's kind of a catastrophic loss for the network, I think. I tweeted as much out, and it seems that some viewers, perhaps even some presenters, might agree with me that they've lost a colleague and one of the favourite shows. He was consistently the top-rated show at his slot for his time across all the networks for quite a while, and he's done quite a lot of good investigative journalism. So I hope I don't burn any bridges with this, because I'm not seeking to specifically criticise GB News per se. I know Mark has his criticisms, but it's more so that they are beholden to Ofcom, and the actual media apparatus itself, how it operates, the legacy media, will never get out from under the boot of grievance-mongering organisations, government regulations, and ESG-compliant advertisers.
I mean, you're definitely the man to cover this, because, I mean, you've been on GB News multiple times, and I know you have a relationship with them, whereas
50,
I don't...
50 appearances, I think.
Oh, wow, that's not bad.
I did a lot more, because I actually used to... I wasn't contracted for Talk, but I had a Monday night show with Kevin O'Sullivan, which was good fun for quite about a year.
Okay. I mean, I don't watch any mainstream media at all, so you're the man to cover this. But for me, this sort of feels like a rehash of that conversation we had 2 weeks ago about Stephen Crowder and the Daily Wire. It seems to be that same dynamic playing out again.
Absolutely. Mark Steyn even referenced it in his video. Right. So we're going to watch a clip from Mark Steyn. But first, speaking of projects which were co-opted and corrupted by totalitarians, you can go and subscribe to our website for £5 a month and watch our book club series, in which the first part of 2, Bo and I went through George Orwell's Animal Farm as a very well-written book, but retroactively it's a bunch of Trotskyist cope about how if Trotsky or Lenin would have controlled the communist utopia rather than Stalin, it would have been so great, guys. No, just like Ofcom, it's not worth having any kind of despot in charge of what can and can't be said and what constitutes a good society. So, decentralization, thank you very much. Unfortunately, we're not going to get much more of that as we'll go through this segment. Anyway, so let's get on to Mark Steyn's his website, his new one, which, Mark, love you, mate, but you need a graphic designer. He's going on a cruise soon in July, and he's inviting some guests, so that should be a good laugh. But he's now got his own show on his own website as he's recovering, because he hasn't been able to make it into the studio because he got stuck in France while he had a bunch of surgery. And yesterday he put out this clip, which thankfully John has edited together, explaining why he won't be returning to his 8 p.m. slot on GB News. If you could play, please, John.
We're going to do a new edition of the Mark Steyn Show this week, assuming my occluded ventricles are up to it. But it won't be on GB News. The state of play between me and GB News is that they have sent me a contract. People have noticed a change. Now, this came up. I was already set to return to GB News, and the habitual liar who runs the joint then decided that we needed a defibrillator in the studio for me to be able to go back. And then a lady who works on the show said, no problem, defibrillators are us, sending one round in 20 minutes. Then he decided something else. So there's this new clause, editorial responsibility. For the avoidance of doubt, as the Ofcom license holder, GB News has editorial responsibility for the Mark Steyn Show and all content produced for GB News by the presenter and the US producers. Therefore, the parties agree that GB News' editorial decisions shall prevail. GB News will ensure that the presenter and the US producers attend regular Ofcom training provided by the company's compliance officer. The Mark Steyn Show will ensure that the presenter and US producers adhere to editorial input provided by the company's editorial director or such person designate. To the extent that the presenter and or the US producers do not incorporate Ofcom regulatory input into an edition of the program, this shall be considered a material breach of this agreement. And the Mark Steyn Company shall indemnify GB News for any and all direct loss liability costs, including reasonable legal costs, damages or expenses that it suffers as a result of any regulatory breach. So the whole thing is, I'm on the hook, therefore, for Ofcom fines, but, and this is the important point, I don't have any say in our defense against an Ofcom complaint. That's all done by GB News. So the Ofcom's bitch, as I call the compliance officer, will be making the weedy, wimpy defense to Ofcom, and then I'm the one who has to pay the £40,000 fine or whatever it is.
So I'm not going to accuse GB News of anything, of course, mainly because I still have plenty of presenter friends over there. But as we did cover with the Crowder and Daily Wire situation, if the LLC company or contractor producing a show on behalf of a network is indemnified for boycotts or complaints, then the network has a perverse incentive to not mount a defense against the regulator, because then they don't have to pay the person they're contracting for the show as much, because they can foot the bill for it and they can recoup some of their losses on their salary.
In financial services, we used to call our compliance officers business prevention officers, and it sounds like the media version is truth prevention officers, something like that.
Yeah, they seem to be an active impediment to breaking lots of stories, because Mark really has pushed the envelope with GB News. If we can actually go to the GB News channel, John, if you look at the live tab, and these are the full shows, not just the clips, you're on it. Mark's show is the highest viewed of all time on the channel, and it's only in the second place there because there is one currently going on. But the full show that he did about vaccine misinformation, definitely vaccine misinformation, YouTube, it is the highest rated thing that GB News have outside of independent clips that are on Boris and the royal family and the like that the boomers quite enjoy. And this is very envelope pushing. Nobody else was talking about it. There are actually shows on other networks which purport to be competitors which said it's yesterday's news, or disbelieved in it, or said that if you don't get vaccinated you couldn't come to their Christmas party, for example. There was also the fact that he platformed Samantha Smith when she was talking about the Telford grooming gang scandal. He's been talking about the Dutch farmers. He's been hammering home on the World Economic Forum. Mark Steyn has never held back, and he has been rewarded abundantly with a very loyal audience, and I fear that by putting this contract to him, it has alienated quite a few people from GB News.
Yeah, and I can understand. I mean, I saw Lawrence Fox. Lawrence Fox is a good guy who pushed back on this because, of course, he's working with GB News, and he said he felt it was a certain amount was misplaced because people were coming after the station GB News rather than regulators Ofcom. But I mean, my sort of take on that is I think that people have so utterly lost faith in government, in institutions, and regulators that the first thing down the power hierarchy that they think has any shred of possibility of being genuine is a TV company. Everything above that point, they've just completely lost any faith of trying to communicate with.
And that is my frustration. I actually think that GB News could have publicly complained about this, put up a fight about it. They've got enough of a loyal viewer base, particularly Steyn's show, that they could work out something in the business model that could either cut costs or attract some kind of subscription or backing or an angel investor or something to keep them on the air. It will be an endless legal battle. I understand it's incredibly stressful, but Steyn is a very important voice.
I think on that clip he mentioned something like, so an Ofcom fine is 40 grand. Is that what it is?
I don't know the exact amount.
Because I mean, I kind of wonder if it's worth paying that every so often.
Well,
and then you could bring up, look, I've talked about this, and we got a £40,000 fine for it.
As far as I know, Mark has had 2 since he's been on air, which is in about a year and a half since GB News got operating around the summer of 2021. Okay. And I know that GB News has recently lost 2 of its original investors. It was boycotted on day one with all the advertisers by a pressure grievance group called Stop Funding Hate. So they've always had problems bringing money in, even though some of the programming is very good, again. So I think they're looking at this as a pure material survival standpoint, but the only reason they're in that precarious position is because they're stuck with an old business model, and the business model could be made malleable in order to retain voices like Mark Steyn's. Clearly, because now he's going out on his own and doing his own show with his own web infrastructure like we do. And again, I wish Mark all the success in the world, and we have reached out and we would very much like to have him as a guest if he'll have us, if he repairs anytime soon. Speaking of his repair as well, one of the things that was very strange that he did mention was that they tried to use the cost of a defibrillator as an impediment to bringing him in the studio. Now, that's Mark's framing. Again, we can't attest to how obstructive that is.
I mean, they're putting defibrillators in primary schools now, so...
Yeah, there's a lot of heart attacks going around. I hope everyone's okay. Stay safe out there. It might be climate change. But obviously, okay, but Mark's company side said he'd foot the bill for that. His production team, he said, lovely lady that works for me, made sure it was in the office, and they were still apparently stonewalling him. And I do know from, I have to be careful here, someone has mentioned to me that Mark's production team, the reason that they're so fantastic at pushing the envelope with stories and they're not too worried about Ofcom is because they're the most autistic production team in the world. And so they are
Quite a compliment.
Yeah, they don't share a lot of producers between that show and some of the other ones, whereas quite a few other producers work night shifts and then the early shifts. So they'll do Mark Dolan's show in the evening and they'll get up and do the breakfast show or work right the way through. They do a couple of shows. Mark has his people. Steyn, not Dolan. Dolan does have some people, but regardless. Yeah. So Steyn keeps a very close-knit group, which is why I think he runs it like an LLC. So it makes sense that he'd be able to mobilise a defibrillator there, so that shouldn't have been a reason why he couldn't be brought back to the office. That sounds to me, if he's framing it in the correct way, like a bit of an excuse. It's not very genuine.
Yeah, I mean, clearly they've got a business problem here. And I do feel for, GB News. I mean, in terms of that business model, they are evidently the ones who are pushing back against this system the most. So they deserve almost endless credit for what they've done on that front.
Yes.
But there is only so far that you can go in that format. I mean, to be fair, even us, because this is a segment that will be going out on YouTube, we have to self-censor a bit. We have to talk about the product rather than, what I really want to say.
Yes.
I have to talk about the statistical phenomena which is associated with that product, whereas I'd like to be able to say it a bit more directly. So, to be fair, we are doing it too because of the business model that we have. But, this, for a lot of people, I mean, boomers, frankly, this is the closest they're ever going to get to connecting with these sort of real messages. And if you're playing that game, well, you have to cut to the man.
Yeah, and I do know that some people have been disinvited or blacklisted from not just other networks, but GB News specifically, for some verboten Ofcom boat-pushing opinions at the time, or just because they've had infights with people who have been in the media sphere a long time, who have connections with either hosts or production staff or higher-ups, and it becomes nepotismal rather than based on the quality of who is on. There was, for example, friend of the show, Abby Roberts. She had a very public on-air row with John Gaunt on Neil Oliver's show about something that we can't get into here. John Gaunt called her a foul-mouthed yob while on air, and Gaunt has since been back, and Abby has not. And I understand Abby has some very strong feelings about some of the GB News hosts. Check out her website for what she has called some of them, and I don't necessarily agree. However, that should not be warranting punishing her just because she spoke up about medical interventions and had already made herself risky to Ofcom and therefore easily dismissible because she was involved in a row she didn't even start. Something like that undermines the faith of some viewers. It's the same way of when I had a bit of a bust up with Mike Graham. He went over the top on Twitter and some of his viewers went, wow, is this how you think of all of us? Really? Okay, well, I'm not tuning in anymore. Even though I tweeted at him a clip from his own network. So you've got to be quite careful about how to alienate your viewer base. We've seen this with Talk TV. I went on Piers Morgan, right? It was perfectly cordial interaction. I didn't really speak very much to him, and the clip did very well. But the nightly viewing figures are not great. And I saw ahead of time when they were going to do the Talk Radio shake-up and bring on more mainstream voices like, and I'm not trying to slight any of these people again, but Sharon Osbourne, Vanessa Phelps, Piers Morgan, who are you catering to? This is a marginal radio network that pushed back on lockdowns and other medical interventions. And now you've got people who are very mainstream talking about banal topics and people feel that they don't have a voice anymore. They go to GB News, they look at Mark Steyn, and now Mark Steyn's gone too. It feels like we're being chased out of the Overton window by government censors.
Yeah, I mean, it's extraordinary what's happened to journalism over my lifetime. Journalism now appears to be basically reading out government and corporate press releases.
Speaking of which, shall we look at the exact things that Mark Steyn fell afoul of? Here's Ofcom's page on combating COVID-19 misinformation. So they say, countering vaccine misinformation resources. The NHS website has the latest information on the coronavirus vaccine, including who is currently eligible to receive it, how it is administered, information on the safety and side effects of the vaccine. Please visit NHS websites in the nations for information on vaccines. Now, the reason I mention that is because any time I got into vaccine stuff on air, immediately the presenters were told in their ear to read out the NHS as counterbalance. Most shows had to do counterbalance. Yeah. If they didn't invite a guest on, they had to read out a pre-prepared press release. For example, when Dr. Matthias Desmet or Dr. Robert Malone went on the network and spoke about mass formation psychosis, didn't even mention anything about medical interventions. And they immediately had to read a press release from some other quack academic from some other university saying this is all psychobabble nonsense, and just for balance we have to refute it outright. And they had to end the segment with it as well. So it sometimes, unfortunately, because of Ofcom, looks like you are directly contradicting your guest and punctuating the end of the segment and rolling to ad break by saying, and everything he just said has just been swept away.
This is all part of a big, wider narrative which is happening all over the place. This is one particular facet of it, but it's something that, I mean, I watched a lot of the World Economic Forum talks that they did recently.
Yes.
They're talking a great deal about disinformation, malinformation, misinformation. It's not just the World Economic Forum, it's all of the big institutions. I mean, we've got the online censorship bill going
Online
through.
safety bill.
Yeah, that's going through Parliament at the moment.
Yes.
The current crop of powered elites are absolutely obsessed at the moment with misinformation, of getting to basically censor us, and this is all just fitting into that format. And another thing the World Economic Forum talked about a lot was they're looking at these statistics showing that the public have never had less trust in institutions and government. And their solution is, rather than addressing those points, it's to censor them even further so they can't talk about the reasons why they distrust their government.
Yeah, so you can't fight back against the manufactured counter-narrative, unfortunately. There's also here, they cite Oxford University as one of the sources that Ofcom has taken its vaccine misinformation policy from. Bear in mind, Professor Cole Hennigan, head of evidence-based medicine at Oxford University, was spied on by a army unit during COVID for pushing back against lockdown. So not talking to all of the accredited academics that they like. And they also mention the BBC. So Ofcom is taking advice from the BBC, the place it's meant to be monitoring and regulating. How interesting, a symbiotic relationship there. So if we go to this one, please, I wonder if there was a reason that a bunch of journalists were told at COVID press briefings that their accreditation and invitation would be rescinded if they questioned the government policy.
Right. Is that when you get the press card, is it?
Yes.
Right.
Yeah. You would not be allowed in to answer questions if you question the government policy too much. Why are you not locking down harder and faster, rather than why are you locking down at all? If you said locking down at all, you would not be invited onto television anymore. And GB News did have a front seat with Mr. Tom Harwood, of course. And proof that there is dissent among the ranks, this comes from our very own Calvin Robinson. So, friend of the show on GB News. Not all of the hosts are on board with complying with Ofcom. Let's put it that way. Now, why the BBC? Well, because Ofcom and the BBC were part of the Trusted News Initiative. We can go to the next one, please. You can just click on that. The UK government and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation were setting appropriate guidelines on what is and isn't vaccine misinformation. And the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation is one of the lead funders of The Guardian, and they also dump lots of money into the BBC, which you would think they're not meant to do because it's state-funded. But no, actually, the BBC have a totally separate journalism training charity on the side, and I'm sure it's just no perverse financial incentive there that if the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation give them loads of money for that, they can save lots of money to not spend on that and keep it all for themselves.
It is remarkable how many tendrils the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation had running through that whole 2-year period. I mean, I'm just randomly reminded of Dominic Cummings when he sat down in Parliament and gave that 2 days of briefings on his experience over that period. And he mentioned Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation like every 20 minutes. They were on the phone, giving instructions on this, that, and the other thing. So they weren't just doing that with government; they were doing that with media as well.
Trump was advised to appoint Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation as his scientific advisory council for lockdown.
Wow.
Specifically by Anthony Fauci.
Yeah.
Speaking of tendrils, also Ofcom has an outlet page on the World Economic Forum website. And of course, sometimes it's not just partner organizations that have this. Sometimes it's just because they recognize it's an important institution and they haven't worked with the WEF and they involuntarily just put them on the website. Oh, damn, they did an article about them. Oh, brilliant. If we go to... Oh, I didn't include it here, but the actual article back in that link, please, John. It says, our reports give insights that members of the Global Coalition for Digital Safety can translate into action. Since the coalition launched in June 2021, members have collaborated on devising ways, thank you very much, businesses can improve their commitment to digital safety, and government officials shared insights and information from forthcoming legislation, such as the UK's Online Safety Bill. So the World Economic Forum are openly bragging about influencing the Online Safety Bill in the UK, which will appoint Ofcom as the overseer of all digital created content on the internet. That means us. So unfortunately, what's happening here is the window is closing because Mark Steyn has been chased off of GB News by Ofcom compliance. Lots of other guests have been disbarred from other networks because of Ofcom compliance. We didn't get the answers about lockdown and unspecified medical interventions when we wanted them because of Ofcom compliance. And now, what are we going to do? If this passes, we're screwed. Because guess what the most recent amendment is? The criminalisation of online misogyny, according to Ofcom.
Right. Well, that's like 70% of our segments down then.
Yeah, well, so Rishi Sunak's currently doing a cabinet reshuffle, and Michelle Donnellan is no longer the culture secretary. She's been moved to business or something like that. There's a new culture secretary because these people are just a revolving door of idiocy. But one of the people that got moved is Kemi Badenoch, which is quite interesting. She's been moved out of the Women's and Equalities Department at the same time that this is being proposed, and that the conversion therapy ban bill, which basically means trans affirmation therapy only, is being considered. And she's been moved to trade. So she's essentially been neutralised in her opposition to the enforcement of woke doctrines.
Because Kemi's like basically the closest thing the Tories currently have to vaguely sensible.
Yeah, even though her husband is a former Goldman Sachs banker and a WEF partner.
Right. Okay.
Yeah, not excellent. They're all captured.
Still the closest you can get.
Yeah, but as the Telegraph article reads, Michelle Donnellan, the culture secretary, now former, is understood to believe the online safety bill has the power to stamp out attacks on women on the internet. What an oxymoron. The plans to crack down on online misogyny come as leading Tory peers, including Baroness Morgan, a former culture secretary, are pushing for the law to go further to include a legally enforced code of practice requiring social media firms to prevent online violence and abuse against women and girls. Under the new online safety bill currently being finalised, social media firms will be required by law to abide by their terms and conditions which generally bar misogynistic abuse. The amendment would give Ofcom the power to fine social media companies up to 10% of their global turnover if they fail to abide by a code outlawing online misogyny. The Labour Party will back it, raising the prospect that the government may have to compromise or face defeat. So it's almost guaranteed to be passed. Ofcom, again, has a perverse financial incentive to play whack-a-mole with anything offensive on the internet that might be said against a woman, not that they can bloody define what they are these days. And the government are enforcing this, and so it's not just applying to TV stations, it's now applying to internet channels like Mark Steyn's will be, or ours.
And of course, the nub of this, it will be how it's enforced.
Yes.
So what they won't be doing is trawling through the Guardian website, trying to find examples of misogyny and then using that as a stick to beat them.
Otherwise, Owen Jones won't have a career.
Yeah. What they'd be doing is they'd be looking for people who say things that they don't like. And even if they can't get them for saying things they don't like, maybe they're talking about statistical phenomena related to products being sold. They can't necessarily go after them for that, but what they can do is scan everything else you put out over the last couple of years, find an example that they class as misogyny, and then take you down with that.
Also, if you can't foot the bill for legal costs as you're going on, then you're going to have to acquiesce to some sort of settlement or fine. So if you are incapable of employing the right amount of lawyers, if you don't have a team like Steyn does, he was prepared to take on his own defence against Ofcom, but GB News was saying, no, we will handle the defence, which means that we will put up a weaker defence, possibly, because then we get money from you. If you don't have the money to mount a defence against Ofcom because you're a sole trader or you're a small business like we are, then you'll just fold. And that's what they're counting on. They're counting on the systematic elimination of anything which cuts against the grain. And the grain is continually expanding. So, as you alluded to before, here's the wonderful Calvin Robinson documenting their recent Ofcom training, compliance training, on January the 26th. And Calvin decided to have a photo taken because he kicked up a fuss. I know for a fact that Calvin's production team are very good. Word of advice to media companies, though, some that I have worked with, and I will not specify which shows, but don't hire fresh out of university students because there is such a high turnover rate on poorly contracted producers, and sometimes producers go rogue and take people they don't like off the guest lists, even though the hosts are friends with those guests. I'm not saying anything more. Anyway, on to the last one. As you alluded to, Lawrence Fox has come out and decided to back Mark Steyn this morning, which is fantastic because for those who don't know, Lawrence has been holding down the fort, specifically in Mark Steyn's slot at the 8 o'clock weekday times, because Lawrence originally was given a 8 p.m. Friday show when they rejigged the schedule, and recently he's been doing weekdays as well and been doing a very good job. And Lawrence as well has been fighting properly. He was just recently taken off of YouTube because he interviewed James Esses, who's been on the channel, talking about trans conversion therapy. We'll put it that way. Don't take us down, YouTube. And they removed his interview, even though James was stating misinformation. Definitely misinformation. And Lawrence makes the clear and obvious point that this is just endemic to the business model. Like, you're directing a lot of ire towards GB News, and I think it is a mistake for GB News to not try and fight the corner and retain Mark Steyn, and at least try and make it malleable as a gesture of goodwill to the audience. At least GB News could have come out and said, Ofcom are cracking down too hard on us, please help. But they're caving to ensure they don't alienate more advertisers. They're caving to ensure they don't get more fines from the government. And unfortunately, without kicking up a fuss, eventually Ofcom is emboldened to now police the entire internet. And so Lawrence is going, look, I'm trying too, guys. Some of us on the network are trying. Emily Carver, Nick Dixon, Calvin Robinson, Dominique Samuels, who'll be back on Thursday. Lawrence, they're all really, Neil Oliver, they're all sinking their teeth into these cultural war issues, but they're being stymied at every turn. And so my message to anyone watching this from GB News, be it producers that I've known, or even if this comes across the desk of a higher up, eventually you're going to have to make a stand. Like you are. We have here, we're still being chased by the online safety bill, the oxymoronically named bill that will put us out of business if it passes, but you guys really need to kick up a fuss, because otherwise you will run aground on the rocks of reality, and you will not only not have any money, but loyal viewers will abandon you in droves. And all the best to Mark Steyn, all the best for his recovery, all the best for his new show, and if any network has any sense, they'll snap him up right away.
If you appreciated that segment from the podcast of the Lotus Eaters, you can go to lotuseaters.com to get access to all the premium content we have on the site, such as the Symposium series, this one on the Roles of Justice. If you'd like to find out what's we're putting out, you can follow us on Getter at lotuseaters_com on Getter. Thank you and goodbye.